20 deaths and 60 severe injuries in just 7 years in the Gulf of Mexico. That's the brutal statistic from 1975 that launched a union push to save commercial divers. It shows how the offshore oil rush ignored a devastating human cost for profit. Julian, how can an industry operate with such a toll?
At the time, Walter, oil companies were operating in an almost complete regulatory vacuum. We were in the midst of a global energy crisis in the 1970s, so the geopolitical and economic imperative was to extract crude oil as fast as possible. Human physiology and the physical limits of underwater workers became secondary to profit and the need to reduce downtime for support vessels and platforms.
So, profit over safety, plain and simple. And based on historical archives, the Gulf of Mexico accounted for about 90% of commercial deep water dives in the United States. They needed specialized labor capable of welding pipes and installing valves at depths of dozens of meters. What I find truly fascinating, yet anomalous, is that the legal battle for these workers was led not by a maritime union, but by the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America. What's the connection between woodworkers and industrial divers?
The connection has solid historical roots, actually. Since the 19th century, the construction of piers, bridges, and port infrastructure required the installation of wooden pilings underwater. Carpenters, to perform their duties, had to learn to dive. Over the decades, as materials evolved from wood to steel, the skills of divers transformed, but their union affiliation remained with the United Brotherhood of Carpenters. So when the offshore oil industry expanded, this union found itself representing a category exposed to unprecedented mortal risks.
And that makes perfect sense historically. Now we must analyze the nature of these risks in detail. Commercial diving in those years wasn't comparable to what we see today. The primary enemy wasn't a shark or a storm, but the physics of gases. Decompression sickness, also known as caisson disease, was at the heart of this dispute. Could you explain the physiological mechanism here and why oil companies had an economic incentive to manipulate decompression tables?
Certainly, the mechanism is based on Henry's law. At a constant temperature, the amount of gas dissolved in a liquid is directly proportional to its partial pressure. When a diver descends, they breathe air or gas mixtures at a higher pressure than at the surface. Nitrogen or helium in deep sea mixtures dissolves into body tissues and blood. The problem emerges during ascent. If the external pressure decreases too rapidly, the dissolved gases don't have time to be eliminated through the lungs. They return to a gaseous state, forming bubbles inside the body.
And the consequences of these bubbles, as described in medical literature, are devastating. Nitrogen bubbles can block blood flow in capillaries, cause bone necrosis, irreversible spinal cord damage, or pulmonary embolisms. The US Navy had developed strict decompression tables decades earlier, which dictated precise pauses and ascent times based on time spent at depth, the bottom time. Oil companies were aware of these tables, weren't they?
They knew the Navy tables, but considered them incompatible with their profit motive. The decompression times prescribed by the Navy could require hours or even days for deep water dives. In the offshore oil sector, keeping a support vessel in position while an operator spent hours decompressing suspended in the water cost thousands of dollars per hour. Many companies, lacking adequate hyperbaric chambers on board, imposed the use of proprietary tables designed to halve ascent times. Subsequent court documents and OSHA investigations proved that some of these experimental tables systematically exposed workers to an unacceptable risk of decompression sickness solely to shorten work cycles.
So they were essentially playing metabolic Russian roulette with their divers.
They'd bring workers to the surface before their tissues had desaturated, sacrificing the integrity of their vascular system to free up the ship and move on to the next job. According to a Washington Post investigation in May 1977, the Carpenters Union presented this data to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. In 1975, they requested an emergency temporary standard. But OSHA faced strong resistance from employers who even challenged the industry's baseline numbers.
The dispute over data was fierce. The union claimed there were about 2,300 commercial divers in the United States, based on membership lists and Gulf of Mexico contracts. Diving contractors associations countered, arguing that active professionals didn't exceed 600. Contractors accused unions and OSHA of inflating figures by counting personnel employed in the North Sea or the Persian Gulf, just to make the industry seem large enough to justify large-scale federal regulatory intervention.
The contractors' defense strategy raises a complex question about the role of regulation in high-risk trades. Their main argument was that deep diving was inherently dangerous and that government regulators, confined to offices in Washington, lacked the technical competence to set adequate standards without destroying the industry. They argued that imposing requirements such as mandatory decompression chambers for every vessel would drive smaller companies out of the market. How much basis was there for this fear of an industrial collapse?
The concern over additional costs was very real. Buying, installing and maintaining saturation systems in hyperbaric chambers required massive capital. Hiring on board hyperbaric physicians radically altered operating budgets. Smaller companies operating on thin margins based their competitiveness precisely on savings in safety equipment. The debate highlighted a classic conflict: the balance between the cost of human life and the economic feasibility of a pioneering enterprise. Contractors argued that overregulation would block domestic oil production, aggravating the energy crisis.
The government's response was neither immediate nor linear. OSHA issued an emergency temporary standard in June 1976, which took effect in July. But oil companies and contractors immediately appealed in the United States Court of Appeals. They succeeded in having that standard withdrawn in November of the same year. That delay demonstrates the strength of industrial pressure, but the union didn't give up. It continued to document injuries and unsafe practices, leading to the formulation of a permanent rule.
Indeed. The union lobbying effort resulted in Title 29, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 1910, Subpart T, known as the Commercial Diving Operations Standard. This permanent rule, effective on 20th October 1977, changed the history of underwater exploration. The regulatory text imposed strict, non-negotiable limits. It prohibited exceeding certain depths using only surface-supplied compressed air, made the presence of a decompression chamber at the dive site mandatory for any descent outside no decompression limit or beyond 30 meters, and defined specifications for breathing gas supplies.
The introduction of the 1910 Subpart T rule also significantly modified post-dive worker management. Until then, an operator could finish their shift and be left alone or sent to rest without any monitoring. The new standard forced employers to instruct divers on the symptoms of decompression sickness and the risks of air travel immediately after diving. Crucially, it mandated that for dives beyond certain limits, the worker must remain awake and near the hyperbaric chamber for at least 1 hour under observation.
That post-dive observation period was critical. Many deaths or permanent paralysis occurred because symptoms of embolism or necrosis appeared while the diver was sleeping in their bunk. The requirement to maintain immediate availability of recompression treatment eliminated the tendency to minimize joint pain or respiratory problems. Oil companies, faced with the risk of federal sanctions and potential operational shutdowns, had to adjust their budgets by integrating safety expenses.
The regulation also generated an interesting ripple effect outside the commercial oil sector. In the 1977 standard text, OSHA initially included the entire community of marine researchers and underwater biologists. Universities and oceanographic institutes found themselves forced to comply with rules designed for heavy underwater construction. This generalization of the law led to the birth of the American Academy of Underwater Sciences, an organization created to differentiate scientific diving needs from industrial ones.
Universities pointed out to OSHA that scientific diving had an accident rate lower than that of bank employees. Researchers decided autonomously when and where to dive, unlike workers who followed contractor orders in prohibitive weather conditions. The scientific community's legal battle won an exemption from commercial requirements in 1982. This event highlights how OSHA had formulated a very rigid law to curb abuses in the Gulf of Mexico, adopting a maximalist approach that later required refinement for non-industrial sectors.
And official records indicate that the Carpenters Union tried to block that scientific diving exemption in court, fearing that the oil industry might exploit the loophole by masking commercial operations as research. However, in 1984, judges ruled in favor of the Academy of Underwater Sciences, consolidating two distinct regulatory paths. But returning to the core of the matter, the union push of the 1970s established a powerful principle that human life is not a variable for optimizing profits in the energy market.
Precisely. Modern operating manuals are the direct descendants of those rulings and union complaints. Before 1977, the absence of state guidelines turned occupational physicians into forced researchers, cataloguing traumas on humans used as guinea pigs in marine shipyards. Federal interventions standardized the use of closed diving bells, systems that keep the worker under pressure during transfer from the bottom to the ship, isolating them from the hostile environment and protecting them from hypothermia, a factor that worsens gas-related risks.
An analysis of OSHA inspection documents from the 1980s and 1990s reveals a drastic drop in fatal injuries among divers employed on U.S. offshore platforms. The history of this regulation proves the vital role of organized pressure. Legislators tend to react slowly in highly technical and profitable sectors until a coalition of workers manages to turn medical data into legal weapons. Decompression tables, once seen as guidelines manipulable by companies, have become the inviolable legal basis of the employment contract.
The pioneers of commercial diving certainly paid for infrastructural progress with their health. The legal framework built around Subpart T ensures that today's underwater work, while remaining one of the most demanding and hostile professions, respects precise physiological limits based on scientific data and not on oil well deadlines. The creation of a mandatory standard forced naval engineering to design better support means, pushing technology to serve human safety.
This clash between extractive logic, human physiology, and union organization clarifies how much the cost of crude oil weighed on those who physically assembled the submerged energy network that powers modern society. If this analysis of the battles of the pioneers of the deep has left you with food for thought, send the link of the episode to someone with whom you enjoy exploring the complex backstories of industrial history.